One of the things that the current generation of tech entrepreneurs seems particularly fond of is attacking the lean startup idea. And the conventional discourse around this topic pretty much goes like this. MVP is a concept that doesn't work in 2024, and you don't really need an MVP if you're ambitious enough about what you're building. Or do you think Steve Jobs had invented the iPhone if he had followed the lean startup method? It usually only leads to small incremental improvements. I was recently listening to interviews with none other than the lean startup inventor himself, Eric Ries, on the podcast that Lenny hosted. And it felt like everyone has read the Lean Startup but hasn't understood the key message. I read it more than a decade ago, and I still ended up wasting too much of my time building something that no one wanted. But that's another story. Nowadays, working at June, I have the privilege of talking daily with founders, and I see that lots of them are still failing exactly how the book describes failing. Which makes me wonder if all the doubts surrounding today's tech culture, starting at the press level, then down to the VCs and entrepreneur scene, is all just some sort of massive intellectual conspiracy devoid of any logical foundation. But at the same time, I can't help but think that it's not 2008 anymore. It's a different world. People don't work in cubicles. Programming computers isn't just a hobby for nerds. CS majors have more students than all humanities majors combined, and 80% of the top Fortune 100 are now tech companies. I mean, if that means anything, the suspicions can all be indeed very well justified. How can something conceptualized so long ago still be relevant in today's world, given that these last 15 years have changed pretty much everything we know about the internet, technology, and entrepreneurship in general? As you can imagine, I authored this video in my head multiple times before finally recording and hitting the publish button. Way too many people have said way too many things on this topic, and given the plethora of opinions already floating around, I thought that adding just another echo to the chamber wouldn't cut it. So I decided to take on a different path. Share something personal that either came from my direct experience on the field or facts backed by numbers and actual anecdotes. Not with the arrogance of those who have told you that the lean startup was the ultimate silver bullet, but with the humble curiosity of someone who has been in the trenches for over a decade and is now seeking to understand what is still good about the lean startup that makes it worthy for the newest generations of entrepreneurs and what instead is outdated and needs a bit of reinterpretation. MVP, the most misunderstood work in tech history. I believe some folks in tech love to make simple things sound complex. So here's my attempt to cut through the noise and get to the heart of MVPs, what they truly are, where they are not, and most importantly, to explore whether Ree's ideas of MVP from 15 years ago still hold up today. Imagine there is a spectrum going from 0 to 100. Where 0 is your product today, just an idea on paper, and 100 is your product in 5 years, implemented to the last detail. If one could wave a magic wand and instantly go from 0 to 100, MVP wouldn't be a thing at all, because there would be no risk. But in the real world, going from 0 to 100, it's a bet that takes a whole lot of time, energy, and above all, money. So our common sense tells us that we need some sort of milestone in between 0 and 100 that reduces our upfront risk, while making us more certain that our ideal product is exactly what people will want. From this perspective, the MVP is the factual embodiment of a hypothetical X risk factor included between 0 and 100. The challenge that most early stage entrepreneurs face is this: what is the X value so that it guarantees less upfront risk and maximize validated learnings? Clearly, this decision is a trade-off. The lower the X value, the less upfront risk we embark on. But the less we validate and the less certainty we have toward our final goal. The higher the X is, the more we can validate our final assumptions at the cost of undertaking much more initial risk. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't mean MVPs aren't an early, unfinished version of your final product. In other words, a 50% X value indicates that you're willing to take on half of the risk and not necessarily that you have to build half of the final things. Products are complex creators with many layers, dimensions, and interlocking parts, more like separate ecosystems than straightforward processes. In crafting them, it is your job to pick the right elements and arrange them as if they, as Alexander would say, create walls. Great MVPs are self-sufficient systems that are not only complete and functional in their initial form, but are also the initial building blocks that allow for the rest of the system to be bootstrapped and built upon. What Rees and the Lean Startup advocate is picking your X value so that you have to build as little as necessary to validate your long-term assumptions. Neither the book nor the method prescribes whether the X value should be high or low on the spectrum. This decision is entirely up to you, and it's influenced by your market and your criteria for evaluation. Yet, it is shocking to me to see that many failed to understand even the very basic idea that the conventional discourse around MVPs to this day that still evolves around arguments like MVPs don't work anymore. But does this playbook still work today? Starting with one thing done very well often just means that your MVP can be built within a month or week. and that likely means that there are already multiple clones on the market. Moreover, unless it's a burning problem in an underserved segment, the expectation customers have is that you also solve the other 5 or 6 adjacent problems for them to justify a switching cost. Unlike 10 or 15 years ago, to build a sufficiently differentiated MVP, a team needs to deal with a lot of complexity and undertake much more economic risk right from the get-go. Think about products like Figma. Their core thesis was that design should be collaborative and accessible for everyone. To truly embody this vision, it was crucial that the design tool seamlessly integrate into an environment people were already familiar with, the web browser. On a more practical level, this ambition translated into creating a browser within a browser. The company spent the first 4 years trying to build a series of disconnected projects to replicate photo editing functionalities within the browser, leveraging WebGL and ASM.js, and all sorts of low-level sorceries to bypass conventional browsers' limitation and communicate directly with the hardware. Figma obviously took bigger risks than most startups dare to, diving deep into tech challenges no one else wanted to touch. But it paid off. They smashed through those barriers and tech hurdles, setting the stage for everything they have achieved since. Still, it surprises me that many people fail to grasp the basic concept, and the most common discussions about MVPs are still centered around arguments like MVPs don't work anymore, or people expectations have risen up, we're not in 2009 anymore, or you can't just put a crappy product out there and expect people to use it. And to be completely fair, there is nothing wrong with that statement. It's true. As consumers, we're much less passionate than we were 10 or 15 years ago, and there are many more competing alternatives for the same task. And unless we see some clear speculative advantage, we are more resistant to change. The point is that, as Eric and Lenny well explained in the podcast, this has nothing to do with the notion of MVPs. It's a mere observation of consumers' behaviors and customer expectations. MVP is in the same as minimal amount of effort. It is exactly what it says, a minimum viable product. Key word being viable. An MVP for a mission-critical application won't be cheap or easy because it requires years of R&D to be truly viable. In contrast, an MVP for secondary service in a less competitive market, let's say a niche in the construction industry, will likely be less complex and may allow for more error. The MVP is a tool to test a set of hypotheses. Whether testing these assumptions is a costly or cheap thing to do, it's entirely subjective and up to you and the criteria that you pick. Then, why at the very idea of MVP? Most tech people recoil in disgust and immediately start thinking of an unpolished, crappy product. Why does, in the collective imagination, MVP equal half-assed, cheap, shitty products? I have a theory. In the 2008-2012 era, competition was low and software wasn't as ubiquitous as it is today. It did make sense for the first tech pioneers to ship an unpolished product fast, launch it early, and see how the market responded to it. Did the customers like it or not? Did they use it or not? And iterate their way to something that was useful and people were happy to pay for. If you're not embarrassed by the first version of your product you've launched too late, did actually make ton of sense back then. For Reid Hoffman and many of his peers, having a flawless, polished product was an order of magnitude less important than getting a foothold in the market before anyone else and starting to collect feedback. But can we say that the same is still valid for today? It depends, but the answer is more likely going to be a no than a yes. Does that have anything to do with the notion of what MVP is? Frankly, no. If you truly believe that having a polished design and a high level of perceived quality is a criteria that you think matters to the point that you won't have customers and get feedback otherwise, you're free to do so, and you might be right. Just keep in mind that the more you invest in that area and increase the value of the X along that dimension, the more you need to be experimental across all the other vectors to control and minimize your upfront risk. I see a lot of entrepreneurs nowadays raising the bar of the MVP, taking much more upfront risk than the previous generation took. And I don't blame them. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the tech sector is now starting to look much more like any other industry. The tech market has reached a certain maturity and a lot has changed from the SaaS boom era of 2008-2012 compared to today. For starters, the cost of producing software has been drastically reduced. The first generation of entrepreneurs is well aware of the burden of planning ahead to buy or rent servers and bare metal. They surely remember the headache of migrating to a new host or going over a checklist with over 250 items in it. Today, if you need more computing power for your app, just spin up more instances on AWS. If you need help for extra storage, S3 is at your fingertips, ready to scale with a click. If you think about it, you don't even need to plan for office space anymore. A co-working will give you a full office on demand. And the same goes for the talent pool available. It's easier than ever to find young developers, assemble a remote-first team, and get a scoped prototype done in a matter of months. It has become easier than ever to build, deploy, and scale software. And as a result of that, Paradoxically, the cost of making a uniquely differentiated MVP has gone up. For years, the prevailing advice to startup was do one thing extremely well, and for a good reason. The first generation of SaaS winners all started with one unique feature that got them a foothold in the market that allowed them to eventually dominate it. Think of PagerDuty. It started out as a simple digital pager that turned out to be a massive company in incident management ops. Hey, real quick. So you're building a B2B SaaS. Let me show how you can turn your product usage into revenue. Imagine you can figure out who uses your product, what features they use, and pass on this information to your success and sales teams so they can engage with your customers with the right message at the right time. In June.so, we already built the reports you need, including dashboards for each of your customers and a way to pass this data to your favorite CRM. For instance, Vev, a no-code web builder, implemented June to get visibility into how customers are using their product and to keep their CRM up to date with real-time product data. It's simple. They added June with one line of code, connected their CRM, and voila. If you want to turn how people use your SaaS into revenue, then check out June.so. I'm leaving a link below. Enjoy the rest of the video. Eric borrowed the term pivot from basketball, not inventing the term, but repurposing its analogy for startup. In basketball, a pivot is when a player keeps one foot firmly planted on the ground while moving the other foot to reposition themselves without traveling. In the context of startups, this translates to keeping the foundational vision of your business grounded, while shifted another aspect, like your product offering or your customer segment, to find a better position in the market. Immediately after MVP, pivot is the second most controversial word of the lean startup method, and for clear reasons. Deciding when to pivot or stay the course is a challenging process that the vast majority of founders encounter at some point or another. Choosing to pivot prematurely without enough evidence can mean missing opportunities, and waiting too long to pivot can mean wasting time and resources on the product that does not deliver. The decision to pivot and the very nature of its strategic shift is deeply influenced by the context in which a startup operates. Over time, as the startup ecosystem has evolved, so too has the approach to pivoting. The lean startup method has always loudly advocated for the importance of pivoting, a stance that has historically led to considerable controversy. Critics frequently see this push to pivot as a license to failure. Yet, I believe it's important to delve into the original context of this idea to assess its relevance and application in today's environment. Most entrepreneurs today don't remember the dot-com bubble of 1995 and the dot-com crash that followed in 2000. As a reminder, the dot-com bubble was a 5-year period from August 1995 where there was a massive wave of experiment and the then new internet, e-commerce, entertainment, nascent social media, search, etc. The idea of the lean startup was conceived at the top of the rubble of the 2000 dot-com crash, a period in time where the internet and the software delivered through the internet was a whole big experiment. In a time where the software industry was a massive greenfield full of opportunities and value yet to be unblocked, it was common practice for entrepreneurs to treat startups as experiments. This was because the cost of lingering on a potential failing idea, despite not being entirely sure, was outweighed the risk of starting anew and possibly overlooking a bigger opportunity. We can all agree that in 2024, the entire software industry is much more saturated and opportunities for breakthroughs are much harder. Entrepreneurs are much less driven by short-term heuristics because it takes much longer and much more work to see if an idea will ever work out. Nowadays, the significance of marketing and sales has dramatically escalated. Success now demands a serious approach to those areas, a contrast to the early lean practitioners who enjoy the advantages of easier distribution. But does this imply that the idea of pivoting has become antiquated? Certainly not. However, the approaches to pivoting have mutated. If before startups could quickly switch paths when hitting a dead end, now it's clear that they need to think harder and move only when they're onto something solid. In other words, it's more reasonable for teams to pivot, not just because their first idea isn't working, but because they have found one that is. After the dot-com crash in 2000, venture capital dried up. Funds launched during the boom were underwater. Angel investment vanished, and many corporate VCs shut down. VCs were no longer pushing startups to spend big and swing for the fences. They were now urging them to cut down their spending. It was a tough time for startups looking for cash. With risk capital at a premium and the public markets closed, startups and their investors now needed a game to save cash and survive long enough to start making real revenue. And to do that, they needed a different method than just build it and they will come. The lean approach emerged as a way for founders to keep their vision sharp while running their operations without burning through cash too fast. It was the answer to a specific startup problem at a specific time. Today, the VC landscape has completely changed, and not just because there's tons of money everywhere, but specifically because investors have gotten much better at understanding the game of outliers and disproportionate returns. In a world where capital is much more abundant, companies are exposed to the opposite risk, overfunding. And this was especially evident during the pandemic, where interest rates were low and there was a hiring spree across the tech industry. Many startups flush with capital, overhired, and expanded rapidly, not always in line with genuine growth or actual needs. Instead of setting the best engineers to work creating the best product, they were busy recruiting and dealing with bloated teams and company growing pains from the get-go. They faced immense pressure to deliver huge return, leading to a go big or go home mentality that often sidelines healthy innovation. That said, even in an era where securing funding is comparatively easier, there's immense value in maintaining the ability to operate a startup efficiently and at a high velocity. Needless to say, this principle holds even true for well-funded startups. Having a substantial amount of capital doesn't necessitate rapid cash burn, especially on hiring. This isn't just frugality, it's strategic. It's the mythical man months that every entrepreneur and the scarcity of the top-tier talent suggest, that simply adding more people doesn't linearly increase the productivity. For startups, especially those in the nascent stages, agility is a critical asset. Founders knowledgeable about the pitfalls of rapid scaling understand that a more significant headcount can become a liability where, for example, a pivot becomes necessary. After all, it's much easier to change direction on a speedboat than in a cruise ship. This is why Stripe, with $20 million in the bank from seed and Series A round, still took 6 months to hire its 2 first people. Is the lean startup approach always the right move? Of course no. It's important to recognize the scenarios where it might be not the best fit. For starters, if you're not worried about the risk you're taking, the lean method might not be relevant for you. This could be either you're flying solo, building something for the sheer joy or challenge of it, and concerned about market validation or proving hypothesis. If this is your vibe, I've got nothing but respect and forget everything I said earlier. The other reason could be that you're part of a bigger outfit with the resources and leeway to bet big. This is the case for larger companies or divisions that can take calculated risk. Or you're part of the exceptionally well-funded top 1% ventures in the market. These companies operate under a different set of rules, typically led by teams with impressive track records. A friend describes these as blockbuster startups, akin to major film productions with stellar budgets, celebrity-like leadership, and major press spotlight on them. These ventures either achieve remarkable success or fail spectacularly. There's rarely any middle ground. A prime example of this is Quibi, a company founded by Hollywood veterans that raised nearly $2 billion before its launch, only to shut down within 6 months. Or Powa Technologies, a UK-based fintech company that aimed to transform mobile payment. The company was once valued at $2.7 billion, but went into administration after failing to deliver on its ambitious product promises. For the other 99% of startups out there, resist the prevailing narratives of success. Get practical, validate your ideas, seek the truth rather than confirmation, and don't fall into the trap of copying strategies from those operating in completely different realms. Stay grounded in reality, do the simple things extremely well, spend lots of time speaking with your customers, get really good at customers' interviews, see how people use your product, figure out smart ways that minimize upfront risk, optimize for the problems you want to have, build something so compelling that users can't help but use it deeply, quickly surfacing their own ideas for how it could be even better. Use your test, your instinct, but always test and challenge your hypothesis early and often. Do not overcomplicate things with unnecessary frameworks. Don't listen to the latest methodologies that the latest social media gurus are selling, and for God's sake, use the Lean Startup method.